David Pluviose, and welcome to In the Margins. I am so thankful to have with us as our guest Dr. Marlee Bunch. She is author of The Magnitude of Us, an educator's guide to creating culturally responsive classrooms. And we just thought it would be so fitting to have Dr. Bunch with us as a part of our Black History Month series. Dr. Bunch, thank you for being with us. Welcome to In the Margins.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for allowing me to be in this space with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. And I was so fascinated just reading you talk about your own journey through education. And I think that, it's just fascinating for me to see how your experiences in education have informed your role now as an educator. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about um, your experiences through K-12, through higher education, and how those experiences, and I think you've mentioned as an outsider and various other situations that have come into play, I think, time and again through this framework. So when you talk about your journey through education, how that journey informs the work that you do now.
I have been in education for 18 years and didn't ever envision myself. I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to be a teacher. And so when I arrived on a college campus, like other college students, I had to kind of decide what was I going to do. And so I ended up going into teaching. I got my bachelor's in English literature. And that became a love of mine. And I minored in psychology. And originally I thought I was going to be a psychologist. And then as I was moving into my master's work, I decided that I wanted to become an educator and be the teacher that I never had. And so I finished my master's at DePaul University in Chicago and went into the teaching field. I've taught primarily at what we would deem diverse or city schools, low SES, so low income schools, Title One. Then I had a couple of years, my last teaching years were actually in a suburban school. So I've kind of been all over the place, but primarily in diverse schools by choice, and have just witnessed so many students need more representation in the classroom and need more Black and Brown mentors. So when COVID hit, COVID was actually what kind of forced me out of the classroom. And I really used that time then to go back and get my doctorate from the University of Illinois. And one of the questions when I had to decide, what am I going to research? One of the things that I had always grappled with as an educator was like, well, where are all the Black and Brown educators? And what does the history of education tell us, or how can it inform our knowledge about what the current teaching population looks like, and offer some guidance regarding some of the issues that we know we struggle with in classrooms, specifically today. So my doctoral research kind of led me to start to examine the oral histories of Black female educators who taught pre and post Brown v. Board. My grandmother was an educator in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and was one of the first Black teachers, female educators, who was asked to desegregate schools. And so just that family history and hearing stories from my mother made me realize, okay, that's it. That's actually my topic. And I went on to interview, oh goodness, 30 people total. So I interviewed both women who taught and their students because I wanted to have the teacher perspective and the student perspective. And my goal in listening to those oral histories was to kind of discover how can we use the lessons of the past and these incredible educators to kind of guide how we navigate 21st century classrooms.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you talk about the unhush framework in particular, how it was developed. And I was going to talk a little bit more about why you thought it was important to actually, I would say, even base this framework off of those oral histories of those Mississippi educators. I was wondering if you talk about how this framework has developed and why was it important I would say, to base it out of those particular experiences of those Black female educators in Mississippi.
I want to start just really quickly with kind of the importance of Mississippi historically. I think what happens in Mississippi is a great indicator about what's happening in other parts of our country. So, Mississippi, especially in the 50s and 60s, was very interesting. Mississippi as a state is one of the poorest states in our country. It also has the highest number of Black residents. And I think that that statistic holds true actually to date. Hattiesburg was a little bit of an anomaly in that it battled with those same issues of poverty and inequities in schooling, but Hattiesburg educators went to really great lengths to get master's degrees. So many of the women, I would say most of the women I interviewed had master's degrees. And when we think about Jim Crow South, and that time period, that was quite the feat. So I think that's really interesting. We also know Hattiesburg is the place of great violence, right? Especially during Jim Crow segregation. It's where the murder of Emmett Till occurred. Civil rights activist Medgar Evers was murdered there. Vernon Dahmer, who was an incredible civil rights activist who fought for voting rights, was murdered by the KKK. It's interesting that on one hand, it's very violent and traumatic, but on the other hand, there's this kind of beautiful strength and resilience, especially I would say in this Hattiesburg community. And that resilience, I think, came out of Black communities working together to make sure that Black students received the best education possible, given that many of the schools and teachers were working with fewer resources and things of that nature. The unhushed framework, I think, came out of this theme that kept emerging from participants about this idea of not being hushed. And that actually is the title of the book that will have these oral histories. It's called Unlearning the Hush, because I remember thinking, I was so proud and lucky to be part of this legacy. And I wished I had known about some of these stories and histories that it almost felt like I was unearthing histories and stories that had been there all along, but I had never been given access to or made aware of. And so Dr. Joyce Ladner, she's an incredible civil rights activist. She was one of my participants. She was actually my grandmother's student. My grandmother was her kindergarten teacher. And Dr. Ladner went on to do incredible things. She's a sociologist. Her and her sister, Dory Ladner, helped plan the March on Washington. They were active in SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, just incredible, incredible things. And I remember saying, tell me about this idea of not being hushed. And she said, my generation was never hushed. We couldn't afford to be hushed because literally your life was on the line and you knew that it was a dangerous, but an important and great duty. There was almost an expectation, she said, of her generation to go out and be change makers and to make sure that equity started to happen in regards to voting, in regards to educational equity. And so that phrase really stuck with me. And I thought, what a great reminder these stories are for us to use our voices to advocate for change. And so this framework, Unhush, is kind of removing silences around Black history and underrepresented history, around archives, around our stories. And so there's really 5 principles that it leans on. And so I can just quickly share what those 5 are. So the UN stands for Uniting for Collective Effort. That was such an important thing that I learned participants from my research did. They were masterful at collaborating with others. SNCC is a perfect example of that. And then the second part of that N is naming our positionality. So being able to self-reflect and kind of name our own lens and how our lens and experiences allows us to interact or view others. And then the other 4 parts, the H is for histories, specifically those histories that are underrepresented, that need to be unearthed. And U is for unlearning. As educators, as everyday people, we all have additional learning to do, and also the unlearning of misinformation or learning gaps that might exist. And then the S is for stories. I think stories are such a powerful way that we can remind ourselves of that humanness that we want to see in the world. I think it helps us build connection and empathy. And then finally, H is for healing. We know that there's so much we have to heal from, right? Violence, racism, traumas of all different kinds, mental health concerns. I mean, there's that list is ever growing. And so I think ultimately that's what we're working towards is to heal individually and also collectively.
You talk about this concept of not being hushed, but the
Mhm.
reality is that so much of what we're seeing in politics and in state legislatures and even local school boards with regards to anti-DEI policies, anti-DEI laws, even just anti-DEI speeches and statements, unfortunately, seem to have the whole concept of pushing those who want to talk about systemic racism, who want to talk about oppression and injustice, hushing those who want to talk about, you know, the historical systemic racism that is the framework of everything that we've seen today. And so it's just so interesting that you talk about not being hushed, but unfortunately, hushing seems to be the theme of the day in so many of our school districts. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that particular fight, that conflict. You're talking about not being hushed, but there's so much hushing that is going on. How can educators in these contexts, and them well, where there's a lot of hushing of DEI, how can they even maneuver, do you think, in implementing the principles of this framework, you know, being that so many of them are in settings where all of those in power want them to hush and not speak about DEI.
Oh, you asked the hard question. You're just coming out the gate with it. That's a question I think about a lot because I've had discussions and heard that question before. And I think I'm still doing the work of learning what that looks like. And this landscape as we know it is changing and we know there's more changes ahead. But I think one of the key and important aspects of not being hushed, not allowing these silences. And we know book banning, we have racial battle fatigue. Not only do we have a shortage of teachers, we know we have a shortage of Black and Brown teachers. We know that Black and Brown teachers who are in classrooms often are experiencing trauma and racial battle fatigue. We know, I mean, these inequities for Black and Brown students still persist and exist. And to your point, all of it is born out of this systemic and structural racism and inequities with this long-standing history. So it's a big, big mountain to climb. But I think the first step in countering that hushing is to unhush. And that was kind of I think my way of giving back was to create this book that hopefully will help serve as a guide and help educators navigate that terrain. But again, I would say the power of using one's voice is something that I think if we think about historically, specifically in Black history, I'm thinking about like a Fannie Lou Hamer and her story. I mean, just wow, right? Another woman from Mississippi and used her voice, as did many, to the point where, she was beaten to a near death experience, and yet she kept using her voice. And so I would say, if I'm thinking about what would my participants do or what would they say, I think voting is critical. We've heard it before, but we've got to keep saying it, making sure all generations, young or old, are voting in every election, specifically school board elections, I think is critical and crucial because we know school boards are often not diverse. And school boards have great power, right, to choose everything from the superintendent to influence which text can be used in a district, all of those things. So I would say voting, continuing to use our voice. And my goal is always to illuminate and unearth this history. if there's so much work being done to suppress and silence our history, I'm going to keep illuminating it, and hope that in doing so and in sharing this incredible history and our stories, that it inspires other people to carry forward that work that was done, before us.
Thank you so much for that. Another question for you. In your book, The Magnitude of Us, An Educator's Guide to Creating Culturally Responsive Classrooms. Now, you mentioned something that stood out to me, and this is an introduction. Culturally responsive teaching is not enough. We must be immersive. And I think that you talk furthermore about how just the instruction is is not sufficient. This has to go into the community. There has to be something holistic and community centered about this work. Can you talk about this concept of being immersive rather than solely being culturally responsive in our teaching, which many would feel that would be sufficient?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question. So we know culturally responsive teaching really was born out of the work of Gloria Latson Billings in the 90s and then carried forward by incredible women and people, such as Geneva Gay and Django Paris, Goldie Muhammad, Zaretta Hammond. And I think actually Zaretta Hammond has spoke about this idea of you can't just bring in a diverse text or create a lesson that you think is inclusive and then woo, you're good. I think sometimes, unfortunately, with all of the things teachers are faced with, things become check off. I got to just check this off. I got to be done with it. So, my extension of this work of culturally responsive teaching really is about community immersion. And that's something that I learned from my research, the importance of being in community, whether that's physically, right? You're literally going to be part of the communities in which your students are. And that's been a shift, right? Like historically, teachers lived in the communities that their students did. And so as a result, you had collaboration with families. You knew the families. It functioned very differently than when school boundaries were drawn. And, now you have a diverse community and white educators who are traveling from the suburbs to come teach in this community that they know nothing about. So I think it's the encouragement to be in community where our students and families are, but also to be in community with one another. Teaching, I think, is a isolating career in a lot of ways. We function on our own island, we close our classroom door, we do our thing. And I don't know that districts support and give time for true collaboration, but I know that that was key and pivotal for past educators who did important collective work during segregation. And Vanessa Siddle Walker, who I just leaned on so much of her work and research for my research, she's amazing. But she talks about that, these networks and supportive networks that Black educators were able to build and create. And so I think we have to remind ourselves that this is a long standing, every day, the work is continuous, the work keeps going. You can't just do a checkbox. I'm going to celebrate Black History Month and I'm good. This is every day you're willing to extend your learning about others, about your own culture, but also about other cultures and people and communities. And how do we do that? You have to be with somebody and in space through dialogue, through physical space to really understand the nuances and come to appreciate and celebrate other cultures and people. You've got to be immersed in it and in that space. So I think that's a really critical piece.
Thanks so much. And amid all of your, of course, research and writing, one of my questions is your work with institutions. Can you talk about some of the work that you're doing presently? I know, of course, you did work or are doing work with the University of Illinois and some districts. Talk about some of the institutions that you're working with and what specifically have you been working them on of late? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I'm the director of culturally responsive teaching and leading project out of the University of Illinois. And one of the things that that project does is it works to help support educators who are going to start implementing culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. So Illinois is a pretty progressive state, and they have created what is titled CRTL standards, culturally responsive teaching and leading standards. And they are going to be standards that not only teachers, but also building and district leaders are going to be asked to start to utilize. And so our role at the University of Illinois is to provide professional development opportunities, resources, and also initially was to collect data from educators across the state to figure out what do teachers need. Because I think the issue with some of the initiatives in education, like culturally responsive teaching, it sounds good, but then the bigger and more important question is, do teachers know what it is? And then most importantly, how can we help them implement and sustain it? And so my work with the university helps to create those learning and development opportunities for teachers and leaders. And then I also teach a course at Rockhurst University, which is in Kansas City, Missouri. And they have a DEI certification that you can get as you're moving through your doctoral program, similar to University of Illinois. And that's actually what I did. I had my doctorate. My focus was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I teach a capstone course and a course about how listening can support our development of DEI principles.
I was wondering if you could talk about the two publications, I believe, that you wrote coming out this year, and the titles that I read: Unlearning the Hush, Oral Histories of Black Female Educators in Mississippi in the Civil Rights Era, out of the New University of Illinois Press, and of course, another one, Leveraging for AI for Human-Centered Learning, Culturally Responsive and Social Emotional Classroom Practice in grades 6 through 12. Two major works covering a breadth of just critical areas that we've talked about in this conversation. Let's talk about these two new books coming out this year and what you hope to accomplish with these two new works. What can our audience expect, those who pick them up?
So I'll talk about the first one. Unlearning the Hush is probably the one that's most personal to me and the one that I'm most proud of. And that is the oral histories of the women and their student who I interviewed for my doctoral research. And my goal was to have that become a publication. I'm really proud of this work because if we can put the names of Ellie Damer and Joyce Ladner and Charles Cooper, some of these pivotal people who did this phenomenal work, but really were just everyday people who were willing to not be hushed and to risk everything to make our world better. I think it's really coming out at a time when we need it. And I know that is the book that probably was life-changing for me. And I wanted to make sure that that history was documented. I wanted it on the historical record. There's a great poem by Lucille Clifton, and there's a line that says, it's called The Lost Women. And there's this great line that says, "Where in the world are their names?"
Mm.
And I thought about that line so many times when I was doing these interviews. My eldest participant was 99 years old.
Wow.
She's still alive, Ellie Damer, and she was an incredible educator. I had an educator who was 98, and her name was Jimmy Heath. She was my mother's mentor and my mother's sixth grade teacher, and they kept in contact from sixth grade to when she passed recently. But I wanted their stories published and also their faces visible. So in this book, you will see images of every person who I interviewed. I was also lucky enough to interview some historians. So my mentor, Chris Spann, Secretary Lonnie Bunch, who is the Smithsonian secretary and who started the African American History Museum in DC. And their historical knowledge kind of rounded out these incredible interviews. So you will see all of the participants' faces and hear their stories. And in addition to that, the book has poetry and artwork woven into the book to complement the stories, because I think art and innovative thinking was so important to the way these educators navigated their classrooms. And also when we think about Black culture, Black history, art and poetry is another important facet that I wanted to bring to life. So that will be out in the fall of 2025. And then the AI book was an interesting one. It was kind of born out of a friendship that I have with a colleague named Brittany Collins, and we co-authored the book together. And one night we were chatting through just kind of our concerns about AI and how do we navigate it? What does it mean for teaching? How is it going to dehumanize our classrooms and add to the problems we're already faced with? And so I think we kind of stand on this like, well, we don't know much about it, but maybe we need to learn more, do some research, and then create something that helps teachers utilize AI, but still keep classrooms human centered, right? And so, how can you educate students and teachers about the perils of AI? And there are many, but also find the benefits. We know it's here, we know students are already using it. And so, to say, I'm just going to ban it or we're just not going to use it is probably not a reality. And so, we wanted to create something that kind of helped teachers think through and work through some of the questions that we were having. And so that will be out in May of 2025, and that's with Rutledge.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, my last question for you is, whether you would have a parting word or perhaps a word of encouragement. You talked about racial battle fatigue, and the reality is that there are so many who are vested in DEI work, who are passionate, who've gone through the educational experiences that you've gone through, I've gone through, it felt what it is or what it means to be on the margins and
Mm.
not included and always an outsider, always feeling that others can talk freely about their stories, but their stories of being marginalized needs to be hushed. And so that's created so much trauma. And there's just so many people that are battle fatigued and they say, you know what, maybe it's just not worth getting into this fight anymore. You're looking at what's happening with national politics and state and local politics. Some people are paying a high price. They're paying a financial price. They're losing jobs. Positions are being eliminated, dedicated to DEI, as we know, all over the place. And so I was wondering if you would have a parting word or perhaps a word of encouragement for those who are racial battle fatigue in the trenches in education, wanting to make a difference, but don't see how their work is making any impact given all the headwinds that we all face.
You're to end with the tough question, too. I think the first thing I would say is to remind ourselves that it's okay to rest. And we've seen that post election. There's been some movements, especially with Black women and Black educators saying, you know what, I'm going to rest. And I think that to give ourselves permission to do that is really, really important, and to name the importance of resting. But then I would say, the impact of our presence in education and our need for our histories and our stories to continuously be unearthed and shared is so critical. And I think about my former students. I know that having me as an educator and being able to see themselves in the classroom for many of them was life changing. It's something that in my own education I did not have, and one of the reasons I went into education. So I think in that regard, I would say you matter. Your importance is so valuable to students. I think about my son who's 7 and his need to see himself in schools and in the classroom, and it's not there. And then I think documenting our stories again is, I've just made it my life's commitment, because I think if we can do that, the education piece in some way will fall into place. I know in my teaching program, I did not learn about the history of Black education. I did not learn about the incredible contributions that Black and Brown educators have made to our country. And I think about our pre-service teachers they need to know that information somehow, right? And so if it's not going to be in a pre-service teaching program, then I'm going to do my best to continue to get that information out. And that's just a small contribution, but that's what makes me feel hopeful. When I think about ancestral history and I think about legacy and the shoulders on which we stand, wow, there's some giants. And so I think that would be my lasting word of hope and pride of think about the greats who walked before us, many of whom are still alive and with us. And so finding those people and hearing their stories, if that can sustain us to get through some of this, I think that's important. And then the last piece, I think really ties into the title of my first book, and that is The Magnitude of Us, right? That's from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem that I love. And it says, we are each other's bond. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And that is so true. The work of Bell Hooks when she talks about the power of community. And so I think that gives me hope if we can do this work together and find a way to support one another, we will get through it. We've done it all throughout history, and here we are.
Well, Dr. Bunch, I thank you so much for your time, for your insights. I believe our audience will have much to gain from your publications and your commentary. So, again, thank you so very much for joining us for In the Margins.
Thank you
Appreciate
so
you.
much. I appreciate you. Thank you for your time, and it's been great to be in conversation with you.
Sounds good. All right. Take care.